This is weird.
I'm the cameraman now.
Usually when I'm filming a video, it's because Jay's like on a cruise ship somewhere, so it's usually Nick behind there. And then now it's like, I feel like I have to be on my best behavior because, oh, it's the boss. The Claw. So when we first tested the Intel Core Ultra 200 series desktop processors, the performance was a little bit underwhelming compared to the 14th gen stuff for us, desktop gamers. But I remember being impressed alongside Jay with the efficiency and the thermals of the new TSMC built process that they used instead of Intel's fabrication for those CPUs. So in a high-powered desktop, efficiency doesn't really matter. I mean, who cares about the thermals when it's slapped under a 360mm AIO? But now I've got my hands on something that those things do matter in, which is the MSI Claw. Yep, this new MSI Claw is powered by Intel Lunar Lake and Arc Battle Mage, and I've been really curious to put this thing through its paces. We're gonna check out how Intel's offering performs against the AMD Z1 Extreme in the Lenovo Legion Go, and I brought in a few results from my old deck testing just to kind of compare against the earliest PC handhelds versus where we're at today. Another thing that's going to be interesting to talk about is my experiences daily driving an Intel Arc GPU for a week, because there's definitely a few quirks and weirdnesses and weird stuff that I ran into. But you know what? Let's just get right into it. So MSI's first Claw was a little bit underwhelming because the Intel SoC that was in there is it was Intel's first attempt at this sort of stuff, especially with its first generation Arc GPU. It seems like they didn't really know how to balance an SoC for the application that it was going to be in, because they gave it like a weird mix of like 4 P cores and then 2 E cores and then 2 LPE cores, and then the Arc GPU in that first chip had like more cores actually than the one that's in the second generation one. But it's been over a year since then. Intel's come out with a new generation of Arc, and we loved the Battlemage GPUs that we tested as far as the desktop gaming ones that they released. So what's MSI done to the Claw with Intel's new set of toys? Meet the new Claw 8. Claw 8 seems like an apology letter from MSI, but with a little bit of snarky passive aggressiveness attached. Oh, weren't impressed by the old 7-inch display? Have a new 8-inch, 16x10, 1200p IPS panel. Double the RAM to 32 gigs because everyone was complaining 16 gigs wasn't enough. And push it all the way to 8533 megatransfers per second. Throw in an 80 watt-hour battery while we're at it. Most importantly, the old anemic SoC has been swapped out with the new Intel Core Ultra 258V. 4 P cores up to 4.8 GHz, 4 E cores up to 3.7 GHz, and an Arc Battlemage iGPU with 8 Xe cores up to 1950 MHz. And all of this wrapped up in what I think is an absolutely gorgeous sandstone chassis. So comparing the Claw to the Legion Go, as far as design choices and overall form factor, it's less of a direct comparison and more kind of like what we've learned in the PC handheld space from the time this thing came out to the, where we're at today. Sure, the Legion Go's screen wins out in size. It's 8.8 inches, 2560 by 1600, ooh, more pixels, and 144 hertz, ooh, more refresh rate. But also those choices seem a little bit weird because 2560 by 1600 on a mobile SoC that's barely gonna be able to push games at 800p. 144 hertz sounds nice until you realize it doesn't have any VRR. You're gonna experience screen tearing the moment you turn VSync off. And the worst thing about that, the screen isn't native landscape, which means when you get screen tearing, it's gonna be vertical screen tearing, not horizontal when you're used to, which is, I think, a lot more noticeable in video games because you tend to be turning left and right a lot more than up and down. Like I was saying earlier, the MSI Claw seems like what the whole kind of PC handheld space has learned collectively. Almost all of the main PC handhelds have VRR. And variable refresh rate is just a technology that I think is absolutely necessary on all these PC handhelds, just because of the fact that you're working in such a power-constrained, low-performance kind of environment. 1200p is a lot more sensible than the 1600p that they gave the Legion Go, especially considering the hardware that's pushing it. Another thing that stood out to me as far as the form factor and kind of just overall use experience between the two devices were the speakers. I had heard other reviewers mention that the MSI Claw has just always had best-in-class speakers as far as PC handhelds go. Now, I've owned an ROG Ally, the original one, and those speakers were actually really nice. Honestly, I mean, even the Steam Deck speakers were solid. The ROG Allies were nicer, a little louder, a little bit more mid-bass and more tonal balance. The MSI Claw is just noticeably a step up. I would probably say it reminds me a lot of like an iPad Pro with its 4-speaker setup. Even at full volume, there's no distortion. The tonal balance is so much better than any other PC handheld that I've used. Unfortunately, in this comparison, the Legion Go has the worst speakers out of every PC handheld we've used here. And so, yeah, I'm just here, just take a listen. It's, yeah.
Start building. Shut the fuck up, because I'm out of time. You feel it? Yeah.
So yeah, let's move past the Legion Go's Palm Pilot speakers. So obviously the Legion's controllers were its kind of selling point. You know, they had the whole detachable switch style, like you could pistol grip it and do a mouse and everything. I feel like it was Lenovo just throwing everything at the wall and seeing what stuck. It was definitely a unique thing, and honestly, props to their software engineers for being able to pull such a seamless experience with detachable controllers and a mouse mode with an optical sensor on the bottom of the controller and everything off. But it's actually kind of awkward to use the Legion as like a handheld with the controller, because all the extra buttons that they had to add to the right side controller to facilitate that sort of pistol grip FPS mouse mode, it's hard to hold the thing and not accidentally keep hitting the buttons until you like, I guess it would be one of those things where if you just owned this thing for longer than, 2 weeks, you would get used to it and kind of know where to place your hands. But it just feels like every time I grab the right controller on the Legion, it's like, I feel like I can't move my fingers anywhere because I'm gonna accidentally trigger something. Whereas the experience on the Claw is a lot more traditional of just, Xbox controller. Comfortable to hold. The joysticks and the triggers are all Hall sensor, which is really nice to see. I wish the joysticks were a little tighter. They're kind of like the Allies where they're very loose and light feeling. Even the back buttons are actually nice and clicky and very obvious when you actuate them. So it's easy to actuate them. It's also easy to hold the Claw like one-handed without actuating the back buttons on accident. Size-wise, both devices are pretty similar. Both the Legion and the Claw kind of are on the biggest end as far as PC handhelds go. Size-wise, I didn't really have an issue with it, even though my hands are tiny. But the thing that you guys can't see is the weight. And I don't think it's just because of the 80 watt-hour battery, because the Ally X has an 80 watt-hour battery as well, and it's over 100 grams lighter. So I think it's just they have picked thicker plastics and materials and everything to do the build quality. I mean, the build quality itself is great. Like, there's absolutely no creaks, no rattles, nothing. It feels like a brick in both a positive and a negative term. As Jay likes to say, if weight equals quality, then this is definitely the most quality PC handheld on the market so far. All right, so let's move on to some performance testing numbers. Let's start off with some synthetics like we always do. Here's 3D Mark Time Spy. We've got the combined, the compute, and the graphics scores all broken down, and the chart is sorted by combined score. First thing that's very obvious on this chart is that the CPU core count disadvantage on the Intel chip is very apparent. But if you look at the graphics performance and kind of the reason why the combined performance is pushed up on the Claw 8, at both max and a locked 15 watt TDP, the Intel GPU noticeably pulls ahead of the Z1 Extreme. 22% higher score at 15 watts, and the lead jumps to 28% when the chips are allowed to stretch their legs and the devices are set to maximum TDP for both. Moving on to Port Royal. Port Royal isn't exactly representative of a typical workload. It's more of a for fun benchmark because it just honestly still blows my mind that we have tiny little handheld APUs that can do ray tracing at all. Now, clearly Battlemage smashes the RDNA 3 GPU in this test. Intel's RT performance is just it's always been something kind of interesting and noteworthy. As you can see, Intel's RT cores, at least against RDNA 3, are very obviously giving it a performance advantage. The next synthetic I tested was Steel Nomad Lite. It's a less intensive version of the typical Steel Nomad benchmark for desktops, and it's cross-platform, so we can throw some interesting other random devices into this chart, just like my phone and my iPad for fun. The chart topper is surprisingly not the Claw, but an Apple M4 powered iPad Pro. While it's an impressive one-off score, the iPad isn't actively cooled, so that score is going to severely throttle after maybe 1 or 2 runs. Unless you're playing games on it outside in Canada in the winter, that's not going to be your steady state performance. I just threw it in there just because, again, it's always interesting to see a brand new player come into the silicon design space and see what they can do. Now, looking at the Claw and the Legion, the gap between them widens when they're limited to 15 watts, which is nice to see out of the Arc GPU, because it means you're retaining more performance as you start to limit the power consumption of the device versus the Z1 Extreme in the Legion Go. All right, moving on to games. So for Cyberpunk settings, I tested at 1280 by 800p because it's a resolution that all 3 devices could share. We used the Steam Deck graphics preset, and I've set FSR or XeSS, whichever vendor-specific upscaler, to performance. With both devices at max power, the Intel chip has a 28% lead over the Z1 Extreme. Story is backwards from Steel Nomad here, where the gap narrows to 15% when you're starting to limit the power consumption. So it seems like in synthetics, the Z1 Extreme is happier at higher powers, whereas in real-world games, it's a lot more balanced between both of them. Looking at the deck score versus the Legions, it is interesting to see because both of them are at 15 watts, so it kind of just shows you the architectural improvements between RDNA 2 in the Steam Deck versus RDNA 3 in the Z1 Extreme powered handhelds. For Forza Horizon 5, we're using the high graphics preset, and again, vendor-specific upscalers on all devices. Forza Tech has always been an AMD favoring engine, kind of like Borderlands 3 in our desktop tests, so these results didn't surprise me too much. But this is the one game I tested where the Z1 Extreme had a clear advantage over the 258V, at least at max TDP. When limited to 15 watts, the efficiency of the Intel chip allows it to keep pace with the Z1 Extreme, so we get coincidentally the exact same FPS number. And the RDNA 2 GPU in the Steam Deck kind of shows you, again, it's just like a nice little how far we've come indicator. Okay, so moving on to actual gameplay capture benchmarks. This data is captured the same way we do our desktop GPU testing, capturing frame time data using %mon for 1 minute each run. Numbers you see are an average of 3 runs, and in Helldivers 2, 1280 by 800, we're using the medium graphics preset, ultra quality, quote unquote, scaling. That's just their name for the scaling factor. Helldivers doesn't have any FSR or DLSS or XeSS or anything. I think they just only offer their own in-house scaler. We got similar results here. The Claw's out on top with a sizable lead at max TDP, with its lead shrinking a little bit at 15 watts. No deck in any of these tests as well because I sold it to Mark, and then Mark broke it. Now, the next game I tested was Everspace 2, which is kind of an oddball choice, but I picked it, one, because it is actually a game that I do play a lot on handhelds because of its kind of pick up and do a couple missions and then you can set it down type of pacing, as well as the fact that it's on Unreal Engine 5. For Everspace 2, we use the low graphics preset, FSR and XeSS, equal scaling. I always just think it's interesting to test these weird new and novel engines and architectures and stuff because it's cool to see the edge cases, and like sometimes where you get something like this where the Intel Arc GPU just absolutely loves that engine and is just destroying the Z1 Extreme in the Legion Go. And yes, these numbers are crazy, and I retested it a bunch of times. I even put them both on airplane mode and then ran the game literally exactly at the same time next to each other because I couldn't believe it. And yeah, just absolute decimation from Battle Mage. And last but not least, I tested Control. I'm using the low graphics preset, native resolution, because there isn't any scalers besides DLSS in Control because it's just such an old, early RTX era game. The game itself, without any ray tracing, is pretty easy to run, actually. I mean, it did come out for the base model PS4 when it first came out, so you know that goes to show how optimized that engine is. Now, I did want to enable ray tracing, but unfortunately, this is a weird software quirk of the Z1 Extreme, but the Legion Go, the specific driver you have to run on it disables ray tracing on the AMD Z1 Extreme, even though the Z1 Extreme is capable of it if you install the standard Radeon driver. So this gameplay is 1 minute of Ashtray Maze combat, and it's an average of 3 runs. I mean, the results are pretty clear. The Intel Arc GPU, again, just showing off all of the improvements and everything that Intel's learned in the time since the Z1 Extreme has come out. It's crazy because the Claw almost matches the Legion at Legion's max TDP, whereas the Claw is still running at 15 watts. And for those wondering why I picked 15 watt as the low TDP number, it's because that's the maximum the Steam Deck wattage can go. So it's a nice comparable figure across pretty much the entire breadth of PC handhelds. Okay, for thermals testing over time, I did our usual cyberpunk stand on a corner in a dense part of the city for 10 minutes test to give the chips a real-world, actual game workload. The Z1 Extreme and the Legion Go runs hot, but that's to be expected as the Claw kind of has double the heatsink and 2 fans instead of 1. Neither of the devices ran hot enough to throttle, although the Legion is kind of a little close. Around within 10 degrees of the 95-degree throttle limit on AMD. The Legion's fan is fairly active almost all the time you're playing a game, which is kind of intrusive and loud. As far as the Claw's behavior was, due to the efficiency of the Intel chip and how cool it ran, the fans were just basically inaudible in any gaming scenario. Maybe if you put your ear up to it, you would hear kind of the air whooshing noise, but not really an actual fan noise. It's just a very quiet, very overbuilt cooling system with a lot of headroom in it. As a side note, which Jay noticed in this testing when he was going through the data with me, the Legion Go's SSD runs really, really hot. Jay looked up the maximum operating temperature for the SN740 that's in the Legion Go, and it is in fact 85 degrees, which you can see in this graph, it does brush up against right at the end. So the Legion Go's SSD sitting in a game dangerously close to throttling, which, I mean, it's not anything bad, it's probably not going to hurt the drive, but you are going to be losing performance specifically because of a design choice that Lenovo has made by putting the SSD under like 3 layers of crap and completely out of the way of any of the airflow. Now, looking at CPU frequency over time was another interesting thing with the Intel chip, because the Intel chip does have separate P and E cores. So you can see in the beginning when the turbo boost timer is active, the P cores are definitely picking up most of the slack. You can see the P cores frequency spiking really high as the game loads. Once the turbo boost phase ends and we get into steady state gaming, it's interesting that the E core frequency actually goes higher than the P core, which threw me and Jay for a loop when we were looking at this graph. And it stays that way for the remainder of the test until you can see at the end when the P cores spike back up. That's when the game exits. I think honestly what it's doing is once it reaches steady state in gaming, if it thinks it can get away with using the E cores to run the game as opposed to the P cores, because of the fact that the E cores are the LPE cores, they're actually a lower power variant of the standard E-cores you would see in a desktop Intel CPU. I think the SoC just decides to use those E-cores as the primary cores in the game instead of P, because what that does is it allows it to give more of the TDP budget to the GPU, which obviously in most gaming scenarios is going to be the biggest power draw, looking at the balance between the CPU and the GPU side of the SoC. And so speaking of power consumption and the slice of the TDP that the GPU gets, so I have to talk about this for a second because the way that the Legion and its Z1 Extreme reported its power figures was a bit awkward in hardware info. It breaks out the CPU power consumption of the SoC separately, but it doesn't seem to break out the GPU side of things. It was basically just CPU and then overall, whereas the Intel chip, we could see both the CPU side, the GPU side, and the overall TDP power consumption. So the Legion CPU power consumption is the red line way at the bottom, which is very low actually. It's kind of impressive how little power the CPU uses on the Z1 Extreme compared to the overall TDP budget with the orange line here. Now looking at the Intel lines, which I have here in blue for GPU consumption, light blue for CPU consumption, and then the white line at the top is the overall. What's interesting is when you look at that transition between turbo boost behavior and steady state, you can actually see the moment where the GPU decides to take over the majority of the power budget. In fact, it actually gets allocated more power than when it was in its CPU turbo boost phase, which makes sense because if you're loading the game, the GPU doesn't really draw or need that much power. And then once you're in steady state gaming and the SoC has kind of realized that, okay, I'm playing a game and the GPU's the one that's under the most load, it allocates it the bigger power slice out of the budget. So the MSI Claw 8, or more specifically, the MSI Claw 8 AI plus A2 VM, not to be confused with the MSI Claw A8 BZ2EM OMG WTF MSI. So the real star of the show here is the performance and the efficiency of the Intel chip. You know, Intel talked a big game way back in the 12th gen about their whole, oh, we've got this new AI thingy, this thread director on chip that's gonna smartly allocate your power and the resources work and matter the most. Honestly, this is the first time where I've seen the behavior kind of act as if there is something behind the scenes that is handling that sort of stuff. The performance that you get out of the Battlemage GPU and its architecture is also just it's amazing what it can do, especially at the 15 watts, because the other star of the show with the Claw 8 is the fact that it's an 80 watt hour battery, which is alongside the Ally X, the biggest capacity battery in a PC handheld, because being able to get acceptable performance at 15 watts with an 80 watt hour battery means you can literally play 5 hours straight. Whereas if you're playing modern games on something like the Z1 Extreme, there is a fair amount of times where you do have to push past that 15 watt sweet spot of like the Steam Deck Max and like it being in the middle of the TDP range for both of these devices. Yeah, the Z1 Extreme, you're gonna have to feed it a little bit more power, which again, in the smaller battery in the Legion Go and other handheld PCs, if you're pushing 20 to 25 watts on a 40 watt hour battery, that's only 2 hours of playtime. Now let's talk about how it was to daily drive the Intel Arc GPU for a week. For the most part, honestly, the driver package has been amazing. The options, I didn't notice any weirdness with stuff like the Intel Endurance Gaming Mode, which is basically, it allows you to choose an FPS, and then conversely, the chip then tries to use as little power as it can to still achieve that FPS, which is actually very nice for slower paced games because they have a 30, 40, and a 60 FPS mode. Like I'm playing Mass Effect Legendary Edition on the 60 FPS mode, and it's cool to see the power dipping below 15, you know, sometimes it hits 12 watts. It allows you to just set an FPS goal and not have to worry about the power consumption instead of the usual way around with these PC handhelds where you're kind of thinking like, okay, let me set the TDP, let me limit it to what battery life I want to get, and then let's see what performance I get out of that. The only negatives about the Intel GPU that I ran into were, there were a few games, most notably Flight Simulator 2024, where it was just a little inconsistent. Sometimes it would crash as soon as I clicked on a menu option. Other times I could get 2 straight hours of gameplay flying all around the world and everything in all different places and loading different planes and stuff up. So I think that's just one of those driver growing pains that Intel's gonna have to tough it through because, again, they're the newest one in the space out of the big three. So the last thing that kind of bugged me a bit was the fact that because Intel's the newest player in the GPU game, they're going to necessarily have the slowest adoption of their own vendor-specific tech, like XeSS. We have like a fully updated FSR in Everspace 2, which is FSR 3. We have the fully updated DLSS, which is the latest version. And then we have XeSS 1.0, even though 2.0 has been out for like 6, maybe a year now. So that's just the thing that you're just gonna have to deal with because of the fact that, again, Intel's the smallest player in the space and the newest player in the space. Not to mention the uncertainty of Intel's future right now. I'm not gonna get into that, but it did kind of pop in my head a few times where I was just thinking like, I mean, it would be cool to buy this, but then like what happens if they just shutter the Arc division and then you don't get driver updates forever? So it's still the nicest package of handheld PC gaming hardware that I've ever used and had my hands on. But for $1,000, you genuinely have to be an enthusiast of new, novel, like chip architectures and PC technology and want this whole spared no expense approach to the device to be able to pick one of these things up. Because I don't think normal gamers, especially people that just like, you know, hey, I heard about the Steam Deck thing, I just want to get a handheld PC because I have this PC game that I want to play and I got a trip coming up or whatever and I want to get into it. I don't think that type of gamer is really going to be able to justify a 4-digit price tag for a handheld, especially with the jankiness of the MSI Center software that's on this thing. I didn't even mention the software suite between these two devices. The latest versions of Legion Space and the rest of the software suite on the Legion Go is actually, I didn't have a single problem with it. Everything worked fine. I didn't run into any jankiness where settings or anything wouldn't apply. MSI Center M, the MSI Center M button, which I will show a close-up right now, has the M upside down, which kind of shows you MSI's attention to detail when it comes to their software suite. It's a W, but it's MSI Center M. It doesn't make any sense. Jankiest, worst software suite ever. If it was like, say, the same price as a Z1 Extreme powered handheld, so $600 to $800 or something like that, the software is just so bad. Everything like from the fact that you would push the Center M button and then it would come up, and it wouldn't switch your controller back from desktop mode. So then you'd just like be moving a mouse cursor around on something that's expecting controller inputs. Or I would apply TDP settings on the quick bar, and they're somehow different from the ones that are shown in MSI Center, which are also somehow different from the power consumption of the actual device. I mean, come on, MSI. For $1,000, I'd like the invoke on-screen keyboard button to actually invoke the touch keyboard and not the older mouse on-screen keyboard in Windows. Like every other PC handheld pulls up the touch keyboard because it's a touch screen. And I think at the end of the day, that's just going to be the deciding factor for pretty much everyone, is just the software is absolute trash and the price is really, really rough. But when you can get an ROG Ally for $650, or literally this exact Legion Go for $600, because it's on sale at Best Buy right now, you can save $150, not sponsored. It's just so hard to justify spending $1,000 on the Claw 8. Even with its performance improvement and everything, are you really gonna notice 4 FPS?
Yes.